All right, welcome back, everyone. So this video here will explain to you guys how the categories tab works within the spreadsheet. It's the last of the setup tabs or worksheets that you need to go through to get everything set up. The good news is once you set this thing up, you do it only once, and then after that, you're good to go for the rest of the usage of the spreadsheet. You don't have to touch this again. This particular tab is pretty important because this is where you set up all of your categories and subcategories for your revenues and expenses. And the best way to get you to understand that before we take a look at the details of this tab is just to show you what I mean by categories of revenues and expenses when you do transactions. So if I go, for example, here to the banking transaction tab, and I want to put in a new transaction. So let's say today's date, so October 20th is the date of the transaction. Notice that it changes that to the appropriate month. And I'll give it a description. It could be anything that you want to describe your transactions. So I'll just call it test, for example. And then either a debit or credit. So debit would be an expense. A credit means like a refund. Or, for example, in the case of your pay, that's money that comes into your account. So let's just say that I've got something that cost me $25 here. And here you can see you got the two columns, category and subcategory. And this is the information that it takes from your categories tab that you create. So here, when I click down to select a category for that particular transaction, so let's say here, for example, I bought a piece of clothing. So that's an example of a category, right? And the minute I choose this category here, the next column here, which is the subcategory, will give me a drop down of everything that belongs to the main category of clothing. So if I click on here, then I've got things for subcategories of clothing. I've got clothes, I've got shoes, coats, boots, jewelry, or other, right? So let's say I bought a pair of shoes, right? And so here, this is the category and subcategory as per what you have defined in this categories tab. So that's why the categories tab is important. You define it once, and then all of your transactions will use what you've got in that list in that tab. And those categories also apply in your credit card transactions. So if I go to a credit card transaction and I enter in something that I bought, let's say 2 days ago, so October 18th, that's a November transaction because remember when I set up the credit card account, I told it when I'd be paying this, even though I bought it 2 days ago, I'm actually going to be paying this in November. And so again, I can give it a description. And let's say this time around, I bought something for $30. And if I come here to the category and go ahead and click here, again, I get my drop down and here's all the list of the main categories. And this time around, let's say I went to the grocery store, then I'd pick groceries, and then I'd pick my subcategory that I wanted to. And you can go ahead and change that at any time, right? So I can go here and let's say sports and health and come here and say, okay, I went to go play golf for that amount. And so again, that's driven from your categories tab. You'll also see that what you define in that categories tab will carry across some of the other tabs. So if I go to the budget tab, you can see here all the list of categories. They come from your categories tab. If I expand that out by hitting that 2 button, you can see all the subcategories that you created in your categories tab. So this budget tab takes its information from your categories tab. The same thing happens in the summary tab as well as the budget versus reality. So if I go here, again, you see the same list of categories that are there. And if I expand that out, you can see the same subcategories here. And so these list of categories go across this budget versus reality and forecast. Same thing for the change in forecast, as well as the next year's budget tab will also use those same categories. So that's why it's important to um, define your categories and subcategories correctly, because once they're set, um, all of your transactions here that you have captured in the past using those categories, if you want to change them, if you want to change your category names and or subcategory names, you'll have to come back to your transaction tabs and make those changes manually because it does not come back and change those. So that's why we set them up the first time around before we start entering in transactions. And then once it's done, we typically don't come back to these things. We might make small modifications, but in general, we don't come back on it. And we just set it once, and then after that, we're set to go for the rest of the time. Okay. Second part to this is okay, well, creating expense categories and subcategories can be a little bit daunting if you try and think about all of the different categories and subcategories that you may have for your expenses. The good news is the way I've got this thing set up, guys, I've put in there the ones that I typically will use. And so it's a good starting point. You can use these as is without any modification whatsoever. Chances are that they do cover the expenses that and revenues, sorry, that you would have typically at any given point in time. So you may be able to look at this and go, I'm fine with this. I don't need to make any changes, or I only need to make small changes to it before moving forward. So you can see here, I've got the list here of in column C, the revenue category with its subcategories, and I can only have one revenue section or column, but I can have many expense columns here, which each represent a category, which is in the yellow highlight, and then the subcategories here for that particular category there. So I support up to about, I think it's 16 different expense categories, for which in each one you can define up to about 20 subcategories. So it's more than enough. I doubt that you're going to need more than that um, to cover all the different kinds of categories and subcategories of revenues and expenses that you can think of. So if, however, you look at these, each one of these categories and subcategories, if you feel that there's any of those that you think you should um, change, modify, then you can go ahead and do that. Now, the way to do that is not to go in and try and type something directly. In fact, if you try and do that, you see that all these cells are protected. And that's because it's to make sure that all the formulas carry across correctly. So the way to do that is through this button here, which is modify categories and subcategories. Now, when you click on that, what you see here, sorry, I'm going to click on this button. What you're going to first see is just a warning message that just says that if you've already started to create some entries in your banking transactions and or your credit card transactions, then making changes here may not be the right thing to do, simply because it this application will not go ahead and change your categories and subcategories in your transactions tab if you make changes. So that's why it's best to set this up first before capturing any of your banking or credit card transactions. So it's just a warning, and it asks you if you want to proceed. So I'm going to say OK. And what you can see here at the top is a section called categories. And then at the bottom here is the subcategories. And so every time I click or select one of the categories here at the top, you'll see its list of subcategories appear. So for example, here, revenues is the category that's selected. Down here, the subcategories for revenues are pay, alimony, the UCCB, family allowance, bonus, dividend, so on and so forth, right? The default ones that have been defined. And you can notice that it corresponds to what's written in this column here. If you take a look at what you can do with this, let's start with the subcategories. So if I click down here, you can see that for any one of these that you select, you can modify it, which means if I click there, you get a dialog box that shows up that says, what do you want to change this to? And you can make your change. You can delete a subcategory. So if I want to delete this one here, I can go ahead and click delete. It'll ask you if you're sure, yes or no, and then it will delete that category. If when looking at this list of subcategories, you feel that there's some that are missing, that you need to add a new one, then you can create a new subcategory and then you type in your name and it will add that to the list. You can clear this entire list. If you don't like what's here and you want to start over and redefine your new subcategories, you can go ahead and do that. You can do sort list, which will be an alphabetical sort. The way that I've set these up, I've tried to set it up where the most used subcategories are closer to the top so that when you use pick lists, they are the first ones that you'll find at the top of the list, but you may want to have this sorted if you wanted to. The key thing is anytime you make a change here, at the very end, you want to hit the update spreadsheet. If you don't, it will still warn you and tell you that you've made changes and that you'll have to update the spreadsheet to apply it. But let's say, for example, here I wanted to, I don't know, just for argument's sake, call it pays, right? And hit OK. You can see it changed it here. It has not changed it up here in the spreadsheet, but if I do update spreadsheet, you can see that now it's changed there at the top here. So I'm going to go back here and modify that back to what it was and keep it that way. You can also change the order manually. So if, for example, there's more chances that I have dividends or that I just want to have dividends ahead of bonus, so I can just hit the up arrow and then dividend will go up one in the list. And again, if I hit update spreadsheet, you can see that dividend went up here, up there. And if I want to put it back down, I can do that and update the spreadsheet. By the way, if you make a change to one of these and there is an affected category, or sorry, there are transactions in your banking transactions or credit card transactions that already use this, either the category or the subcategory, it will warn you. It will tell you that you're making a change to something for which you already have transactions associated to it, right? So just to make sure that you understand that you're about to change something that you already have transactions for. At the top here, if I go now to the next guy, revenues will always be the top one. That's just by design in this spreadsheet. If I try and take the checking account and move it to the top, it'll tell me you can't move it because the revenues must remain or must be the first one at the top. But any of these other guys here, you can move them around. Like I've put them, in this case, they are in alphabetical order, right? But if you want to change the order in which these appear, no issues there. By having it in alphabetical order, it just means that when you pick from the categories list in your transactions tab, they will show up by alphabetical order. But if for some reason I want entertainment to be ahead of education and work, then all I have to do there is just go ahead and change that order here, and it will change it. And in fact, you see entertainment is highlighted here. It hasn't been changed yet, but if I go ahead and update the spreadsheet, that actually goes ahead and it changes, as you can see, the order of everything in the spreadsheet. And now entertainment has moved ahead of education and work. So it does that for you. You don't have to worry about that. So it just makes things pretty simple. So if I just go back and put that up here, I can again do that and update the spreadsheet and it will pull it back to the way it was. Okay. You can modify a category name if you want to, just like a subcategory. You can make a change here if you wanted to. You can delete a category. You can sort them, which will be an alphabetical sort with however revenues staying at the top. And of course, you can update the spreadsheet whenever you make the changes. Same rule applies. If you make a change and you don't hit the update spreadsheet, when you hit this done button at the end, it will check for that and it will tell you that you need to update the spreadsheet if you want to keep the changes that you've made. Okay, and now the last thing that I want to do is just cover these categories real quick for you, just so that you know what's in there. When you get the spreadsheet, take some time to take a look at that and decide what changes you want to make, and go ahead and make that. So let's just take them one by one. So under revenues here, again, I was trying to create categories that over the years um, that either I have been suggested to add those categories or I've used them myself. And so they should, under revenues, this should cover most of your needs. Your biggest one, of course, is going to be your pay. You got things like an alimony, and in this case here is if that means if you're receiving an alimony, if you have to pay alimony, you can leave that as a revenue, but you'll put that as a debit instead of a credit. But let's not get into that for now. You might get things like a bonus or a dividend. These last guys where I put savings dash whatever, so trips, taxes, whatever, I put that in there because some of you guys have got banking accounts where when monies are deposited, you have like sub accounts that you can associate to it where money gets filtered to. So you might say, well, every time I get a paycheck and deposit that, X dollars goes towards my savings for towards trips or to pay my either income taxes or house or municipal taxes, or towards the maintenance of my house or the maintenance of your car. So some people do that. And if that's the case, then I've got these categories here. And you can change that if these savings types of categories don't correspond to your things, then just go ahead and modify that or delete them if you don't need them. But we'll talk about when we get to the transactions tab how we could use that. So an example would be you get your paycheck deposited, you keep X number from your pay, and then the rest just gets funneled into these different savings. And I'll show you how to do that as part of a transaction. Then you get into checking account, and most of this will have to do with withdrawals. So if you go to the ATM, that'll show up in the transaction in your actual checking account, and so you can capture that here when you're doing transfers of money from one bank account to another. If you have monthly fees to have your checking account, that would go there. Any other admin fees that would go that you would incur, that won't typically happen to you guys. That would be special fees, for example, to have a special check made out to someone else. There's sometimes fees associated with that. That's an example. If you earn interest, if you've got a line of credit and you're using it and you've got interest that is associated with your line of credit, you could put that here or any other, right? Clothing, pretty self-explanatory. I just put in these here. You can pick and choose what you want. You can change those. You can keep those. Credit card fees. If you have annual fees, I capture that. You don't have to. So you can remove the category completely if you wanted to. But I've got an annual fee for my Visa, for example, and so that's where I'd capture that. I don't have any for these other two cards, but I put it just in case. I combined education and work together simply because there are just a few subcategories to it. So things like tuition, books, supplies, your bus pass, graduation fees. That's obviously everything that has to do with education. If you're working and you incur expenses, then whenever you're paying for something, which would be for work related, and that you know you're going to get a refund for it, so you can capture that as a work expense. And then when you get a refund, you can capture that as an expense refund, and that would be a credit. And again, we'll talk about that in the transactions tab. Entertainment, I've got a few there. Again, make your changes as you want. Here's a good example of maybe changes that you'll want to make. So gifts, I just defaulted that to if you want to create or track amounts of monies that you spend on gifts for different people in your life, you can do that, right? So I put that, so gift for a spouse one, you can actually give it a name, right? Child one. So for example, here, if I wanted to track, the amount of gifts that I've made for one of my kids, I could go in here and type in Kevin, right? And then that would be all the expenses for gifts that I have spent for Kevin, right? And that would be a good example of changing these spouse one, spouse two to specific names that mean something to you, right? So I'll go back and put this to what it was before. Groceries, so here's a good example. I made changes and it's just telling me about the changes and that they're unsaved. So I'm going to hit OK. Now it's going to change that, or just go back and make sure that all those changes applied. Now you can see child one, I actually put a space in there. So it did apply that change that way when I renamed it. So I'll go OK and hit the update spreadsheet, and there you go. Groceries, pretty straightforward. I just broke it up between food and alcohol, and that's just because it's good to know how much you're spending on food versus alcohol when you're buying that. You don't need to track it that way, but it's as you wish. Here's all the household expenses that I've got. Good examples of that: mortgage, insurance, and you're getting in your case, for example, we could put in something that's called rent. As you can see, I didn't put that in there. So there's a good example. Let's put in right after mortgage, for example. Let's say I want to create a new subcategory and I'm going to call it rent. So if you're in an apartment, there you go. Your rent would be there. And then I'm going to update the spreadsheet. And so now rent has been added here. Okay. So different categories that are there. Other examples, utility for water, phone, cable, internet. I put things like Netflix. Anything else that you can think of can go in here and make that or capture it that way in terms of subcategories. Income taxes, that's when taxman comes once a year. How much federal tax I have to pay, provincial tax I have to pay if I get a refund from the federal or a refund from the provincial, if I had to pay an accountant to do my income taxes. That just allows me to capture every year or track every year what kind of income taxes I am paying, and that helps me for budgeting for the next years after. If you have life insurance policies that you're paying for, then this would be the amounts that you're paying. So that allows you to track how much you're paying for life insurance. Your medical expenses, going to see the dentist, orthodontist, optometrist, physio, so on and so forth, are all in there. Again, you can add the categories and or modify the subcategories that are there. Personal care, you can do what you want there. I put a few in here. Sports and health, so that just allows you to capture everything that has to do with sports and health related. So here you got good examples of the gym, golf, buying sporting equipment, supplements. If you're buying supplements like powders and stuff like that as food supplements, then you can capture that there. You can add that in for more subcategories if you wanted to. And then finally, vehicles that I've got in there. And I just showed you an example here where I'm tracking it and spreading it between two different types of vehicles. I've got my car and I've got the motorcycle here, and that just allows me to capture the expenses for each one of those. So for the car, I've got the loan, the insurance, the fuel, maintenance, license plates, driver's license, tires, equipment, and anything else. And then it's the same thing all over, but for the motorcycle. So that allows me to kind of sort of see how much it cost me for the different types of vehicles, and then it's all rolled up to things like vehicles. The last three are empty, just placeholders. That's why I call them ZZ1 through 3, and I call them ZZ just because in a sort, it keeps them at the end of the list. and they're just placeholder. In other words, if you don't have enough with what I've currently defined, then you still have three other categories that you can create here. So you would modify the title, or sorry, the name of the category, and then you would modify the subcategories for it, hit the update spreadsheet, and now you would have your new category and subcategories created. And you could then move it up or down in the list to where you want it to see in the list. So if it's in the alphabetical order, you drag it up to where it needs to be in the alphabetical order. And that's kind of it. Once you're done, you just hit the done button down here, dialog box disappears, and you're back to everything that you've created here. Um, my suggestion is once you're done with that, this is the last of the setup tab. You're actually now ready to use this spreadsheet. My suggestion is for you to go ahead and save that. And so, for example, here, this is my budget template in the English version. Once you've saved that as part of your template, then you're ready to start working or using the spreadsheet. And what I suggest that you do is that you make a copy of that. So if I go to where I'm keeping this here, so you can see the budget template right here, which I've just saved as of today. What I suggest is that you now create a copy. So I did this before. I'll delete the previous copy. But take your template, keep it in a safe place because that now has everything set up correctly. Make a copy. So I'm going to copy and then paste. And so here's the copy. And then change it to your name. So, and give it a year. So for example, if this is going to be now my budget and tracking for 2020, you could call it 2020, then give it your name, and then you can call it budget and tracking, right? And so from this point forward, this is the guy that you use. Don't touch your budget template anymore because next year you're going to want to start from scratch from the same template to create your 2021 version, right? So that's why you leave this one as is and then create your new one to start working with that one. And that is it, guys. I'll see you in the next video.